Hello and welcome back to Anchor. This is Justin. I'm here again with Brian. Today's podcast is going to be a part 2 and understanding our heritage. Brian, last week you had made a statement that ultimately that podcast last week was going to lead into a discussion of the Founding Fathers.
Yeah, when you talk about the forefathers, first of all, obviously, and it's undeniable that they came with a purpose and a plan. And they came to worship the one true God. And they established a system to govern themselves by faith, and the laws and morality that were established, they established from the Bible. Those things can't be denied. May not agree with it, but historically, they're factual.
So is there a connection between the forefathers and the Founding Fathers?
Well, when you think of the Founding Fathers in relationship to the forefathers, you ask yourself these questions. Did they embrace the same ideology? In other words, did the Founding Fathers embrace the same ideologies that we've already discussed concerning the forefathers? Did they create the foundation of this country with the same mentality? That's the questions.
Yeah, because, there's a lot of people who believe that the Founding Fathers were agnostic or atheists.
Yeah, atheist or agnostic at best. And so, so we ask the question, can the two questions that I just asked be answered? Is there a way to know truly that the Founding Fathers did embrace the same ideology as the forefathers? To answer that question, I think there is so much information, and you know this, writings and documents, just recorded history. There is so much proof. We could go on with this for days and days and days. There's that much proof to answer those two questions. But, for our discussion, to me, one of the best places to look for a definite answer to this question really is to the Declaration of Independence.
How so?
The Declaration of Independence is obviously a valuable document to this country and to the citizens of this country. So much so, you still think about the movies National Treasure. I love those movies. Nicolas Cage,
yes,
and the first one concerning the attempt to steal the Declaration of Independence, and that's really what the movie centered around. It just really kind of underscores there is still much value placed on the Declaration of Independence. And I don't think there's probably a true patriot in this country, regardless of their religious affiliation, regardless of their heritage, their background. There's not a true patriot, I don't believe, in this country who would not agree that the Declaration of Independence still holds such value, and there's so much to learn, and it's such a guideline for our country today. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree.
Well, most people are familiar somewhat with the Declaration of Independence. Most people don't realize that there were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Most everybody's familiar with one or two because they're the famous of all of the founding fathers and of all of the people that were instrumental. There are only a few, really, that are well noted and famous, you might say. But there were actually 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Of those 56 men, over half, 29 of those men, held seminary degrees.
Wow. Very
few people know that. Go ahead.
I was listening to David Barton from Wall Builders, and he had made the comment, he was discussing the Declaration of Independence and how we immediately focus on, this is just an example, how we focus on taxation without representation was the main reason for the Declaration. But he said that was actually like number 17 on the list. And he said those points were actually preached in the pulpit throughout the nation at that time. People just didn't come up with those.
And there are some pretty weighty names. We talked about over half of the gentlemen held seminary degrees, and some of those names are going to be familiar to you. John Adams, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Harrison, Charles Carroll. And the list goes on and on and on and on. So I think that goes a long way in understanding, if we see their identity, who they were, certainly we start to begin to understand where their values, what their mentality was and would have been. And of course, having said that, again, there is document after document, quote after quote from these gentlemen, over and over and over again. Historical records. It's undeniable. These men were Christian.
Yep. And did you
in every sense of the word.
And did you realize that the first congressional meeting that they had, they opened with prayer? They opened with prayer and Bible study.
It's interesting that you say that, because the big thing now is separation of church and state, that the paths should never cross. In July of 1777, a request was made to Congress for more Bibles in this country. Because of the time of conflict and because of things happening so rapidly, there were those who were in the position, like these men, who believed that there weren't enough Bibles that being imported into this country, that not enough people possessed the Word of God. So there was a special committee that recommended to the Congress, and in that recommendation, it first of all said something like this concerning what they had found. It said the use of the Bible is so universe and its importance so great. And then it goes on in that recommendation, and they say this: the recommendation to the Congress is that the Congress will order the Committee of Commerce to import 20,000 Bibles from Holland, Scotland, or elsewhere into the different ports of the states of the Union.
Wow.
And we cry separation of church and state. That was not the mentality that our founding fathers had.
Right, and after the separation from England, one of their laws was they couldn't have an English Bible if you lived in an English-speaking country. And so one of their first movements within a month was to press forward to print an English Bible.
Well, after even, that happened in Holland, and then with the forefathers, and then with the founding fathers here, after this recommendation was made to Congress to import 20,000 Bibles, what ultimately happened was this: that English language Bibles were printed right here and approved by Congress, and in the opening pages, and this will get people in the educational system that do not believe that prayers should be in school and Bible should be in school, and even in our community close by, in a community close by to us, the attack by the ACLU, that the Gideon Bibles, they should not be handed out in schools, and but this first Bible that was printed by the United States Congress, in the opening pages you will find these words in regards to this Bible. It says it's a neat edition of the Holy Scripture for use of schools.
That's very interesting. And I'm sure that if everybody's listening, the separation of church and state, especially in the education system, that would have to make you think a little bit. Because it wasn't so. That was what appears to be one of their main textbooks.
Yeah, it was.
In the school. And rightfully so. So, how have we got to where we're at? Looking back very clearly so far, we see that there was a lot of inspiration as far as like the Christian belief is concerned. Where did that go? What's happened?
Well, for one thing, and it's really been one of the main points of this discussion, we have forgotten who we are. We have forgotten where we came from. We have forgotten in the society that we now live, because in generations past there was intent there was a time when there were small groups who intended to distort, to mishandle and misalign history for their own purpose, which was to separate, the religious aspect, from this country. There are books written about it today. There are still people, academics, who adamantly insist that our founding fathers did not have Christian principles in mind when the government for this country was established and the educational system was established.
So this seems to be kind of like a process.
Yeah, it didn't happen overnight. I mean, it was a process of change, and not good change, but it was a process where people, anytime that you distance yourself from your heritage, it's going to have dramatic effects and definite effects in the future. And I think we're seeing that now.
Brian, do you think that people's just got to the point where they just don't care anymore?
I think that my generation didn't care. My generation didn't care. The generation that's coming up now just don't know. So it's that process. Ultimately, someone misquotes, someone misdirects people in regards to our history, and then somebody doesn't stand up and say, "Wait a minute, that's not correct. That's not right at all." And then after time, nobody's standing up and saying, "Wait a minute, this is not correct at all." And so you have people who are just hearing information, and it's incomplete information. Let me give you an example. Just this past couple of weeks, you've heard so many people on the news and different areas of media talk about the Gettysburg Address, and I've seen they've quoted various parts of the Gettysburg Address with President Lincoln and celebrating that and things of this nature. And the interesting thing is that the complete Gettysburg Address and what he had to say was not given to the American people through the media, because if you look at what President Lincoln had to say, God's all over it. He was very deep in his convictions. Now, we may not agree with everything that he did or his ideologies, but it cannot be denied, if you present it in its purity of what he had to say, that there were deep Christian convictions.
Just hearing all this just gets under my skin. It just lights a fire under me. It reminds me, I was also listening to David Barton. I suggest anybody listening to go to wallbuilders.com and check out what they have there. But he was talking about John Adams and the Congress. They had, I think it was like 12 or 13 prayer proclamations. When the nation had a need, they would, as a nation, not just a Congress, as a nation, they would fast and pray. And then when the Lord answered their prayer and helped them with whatever it was, they gathered again and they gave thanks, and they prayed and gave thanksgiving. They had a need, they fasted and prayed. And it was just like, we are so far away. And nobody knows to question these things anymore.
I get frustrated myself. As a matter of fact, I listened, and we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast before we ever went on air. I had listened to our first discussion, and I could feel myself getting amped up. And you can, if you listen to it, people who are listening may not know, but I could hear myself getting amped up, and I was talking really, really, really fast because it does. To know what we really came from and what they really had to say, it's really frustrating when you hear people completely contradict. When you see our government today and people who are in our government today who feel like they have to walk so carefully not to offend, and the question of whether under God, we should use the term under God, and and things like that. It's very frustrating, And you wonder what our founding fathers would think if they could see us today.
Yeah, exactly like what Abraham Lincoln would have to say for them taking out the substance of what his message was, what his address was. And that was like in a study we did on Wednesday a couple weeks ago, like the Los Angeles County seal. If you look at the old Los Angeles County seal, there used to be a cross on there. And if you look at the new county seal, it's no longer there because they were afraid that people were going to become offended or upset about those things.
You know, oftentimes the same groups or the same peoples who are adamantly convinced and trying to convince others that, you know, there's no Christian basis or principles in regards to the founding fathers and the work that they did, but they celebrate these people, but deny the fact that they were Christian in their ideology.
Right. And you mentioned our government and everything. Collectively, what we've discussed up to this point, right now, our president had made a quote when he was in Turkey. I don't know if it was a couple of years ago, but he said to the prime minister, he said, although we have many Christians, we do not consider ourselves a Christian nation. He goes on to say, and you can YouTube this, he goes on to say, we are a nation of citizens with ideals.
Yeah.
That are guided by ideals. And just to hear him say that and take everything into account, what would they say to our president now making statements like that?
Well, let me answer that by giving you just a portion, a quote from our first president in his inaugural address, which, by the way, is not often taught in its entirety, if it's taught at all, to our kids today in the educational system. But let me answer that by giving you a quote from our first president, the very, very first inaugural address. In it, he said this, speaking to the citizens of America in New York City, he said, "We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." That was the ideology of our first president.
Such a contrast now, isn't there?
Yeah.
Such a contrast.
And if you read the quotes of George Washington, I mean, he was convinced that apart from the Bible, apart from the teachings of the Bible, apart from thanksgiving and worship of God, that you cannot expect the blessings to continue in this nation. And he was right. We see it happening today. Yeah. But here's the thing. These people that we hold in such high regard are founding fathers, but we don't listen to them. And who should know better, how this nation should function than the people who created the very foundations by which we live? But we're not listening to them.
It doesn't make any sense, does it?
We would rather, it comes down to this, Justin, we would rather disregard history than to trust the one true God. It's that is as old as humanity itself. It really comes down to that. It is just what we are doing as a people, as a whole, not everybody, but as a whole, as a nation, what we are doing is actively and intentionally rejecting God. And our first president understood what would happen, and he wasn't the only one, understood what would happen ultimately to a people who dared to do that.
And so now we live in a nation full of identity crisis, right?
We do.
Everybody's suffering with identity crisis.
We do.
It's very sad that it's had to come to that point, but it's very deliberate, taking everything into consideration. Very deliberate.